Hello and welcome again, everyone, to our Wednesday News Hour, where we hear from social entrepreneurs and their teams from around the world about timely topics and solutions. Today we are back after a short summer break, so I hope you especially enjoy our conversation today and you'll join us in the Wednesdays coming forward. My name is Maria Merola. I'm the country director of Ashoka Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. I'm based in Buenos Aires, and I also co-lead our Ashoka's global work on migration. We are so thrilled to have many of you joining today from Ashoka's global community, and also a big welcome to those joining from the Welcome International amazing community and Maldita.es communities from around the world. We truly have an international audience today, so we are super proud and happy about that. I'd love to introduce today's guests to our conversation. David is the founder of Welcoming America and Welcoming International. Since 2006, he has been leading a quiet revolution in the world of immigrant integration, creating a world where everyone feels at home. He's joining us today from Berlin, so welcome, David. Super happy to have you.
Thanks so much for having me, Maria.
And Clara, next to me as well, is the founder of Maldita.es. Maldita is a Madrid-based nonprofit fact-checking media outlet that leverages data journalism and civic engagement to combat misinformation. Clara, so thrilled to have you joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Maria. I'd love to do this in Spanish, having a Spanish-speaking audience, but we will do it in English because we do have great interpreters today.
Yes, we do. And we can also commit to a next session in Spanish as well.
Sí, próxima vez en español, está bien.
Fantástico. So, Clara, David, thank you again for joining me today. I'm super thrilled to be talking to you and having this conversation today. And I would love to start by having our audience know you a little bit more. So David, you and your network have been perfecting the art of building welcoming communities. What does that look like in practical in the field? And how is it different from what most people were already doing in the field of migration and migrant integration when you got started?
Sure, thank you. And I just want to say the template where I came to the idea of the power of welcoming was from a personal experience. I was welcomed back in 1999 by a family in Ecuador where I lived for a year and taught English. But I was welcomed by them, and it made a huge difference in my life and my experience. And I went back to the United States wanting to figure out how to create welcoming communities, because I see that it's so important for helping people to reach their full potential. And I experienced that firsthand. But a welcoming community, we started with the community of Nashville in the United States, and then built out from there. But a welcoming community, whether it's Nashville or anywhere else, is really about creating a welcoming culture. So this is if an immigrant or a refugee is entering into a community, usually there is not, first of all, an intentional welcoming culture. There may be a tolerant culture, but to create a welcoming culture, which is what we all want in the end. I don't want my kids in Berlin to be tolerated. I want them to be welcomed. In order to create that, it takes an infrastructure. It takes, a group of people from within that community who are focused on changing the messages that people are hearing, sending positive messages about the shared values immigrants bring, about the, also the economic and other contributions. It takes dialogue taking place across communities. Without that, it's like immigrants and refugees are like seeds being put into a garden. And the seeds, English job training or English classes, that's like putting a seed in the garden and pouring all the water on the seed. What we did in Nashville was we focused on how do we create the soil to be welcoming also. And so the welcoming culture, creating an infrastructure for dialogue, for communication, it's all about creating that fertile soil, because without that fertile soil, the seed's not going to fully grow. It's not going to reach its full potential. The other part of welcoming in a community is to have welcoming institutions. And in order to do that, we bring together immigrants and refugees, all of the other stakeholders, the business community, the government, especially government, but also civil society, to change all of the different policies and institutions to make sure that they reduce all the barriers that immigrants and refugees face to reaching their full potential. And so when someone enters a welcoming community for the first time, they're going to feel more welcome, and they're going to be much more likely to bring what they have to bring to the entire community.
It's wonderful. I love the soil metaphor. And Clara, what about you? You started your career as a journalist, and what was the turning point, the point in your career that led to you to create Maldita?
I am still a journalist. I hope so, at least. So I was a TV journalist. I was very young. I was an intern in a national TV station here in Spain. And when the 2011 protests took by around the world, the 99% protests, I realized that on media in general, especially on TV, we didn't have an interaction with the audience to actually understand which were the things that were directly affecting them and that needed answers and data around. So I started thinking with a colleague that we needed to rethink the way we were doing journalism and not so much deciding which were the topics that were interesting to people by ourselves, but actually asking them what were the things that they were not understanding, that they need more context around. So we basically started talking to our audience in a very organic way. We opened a WhatsApp tip line and started listening to which were their questions. And we realized that there were a lot of topics that weren't being spoken about on regular media that we could address. And we found, addressing disinformation, that migration and data and perception and myths around migration and refugee were a very hot topic within the Spanish population that needed many more answers, much more context, and much more data.
That's wonderful, Clara. And especially focusing on the challenging times we are going through and living and learning about, how do you see narratives about misinformation and the narratives in general about migration have changed or spread during the pandemic, in times in which our human mobility has been reduced, but how has the conversation and the misinformation about this evolved during these times?
You want to go ahead, David, or should I?
Please go ahead, Clara.
So I think that one of the things we've seen the most is because throughout the pandemic, we were all at home consuming much more information, and we had probably much less fact-check verified information, especially around the pandemic, but also around other issues surrounding it. We realized that there has been a much higher demand for fact-checking and fact-checked information. The other thing that it's made a difference, and I think this has been a trend in Europe even before the pandemic, but it has got stronger in the past year or year and a half, and David can tell us if this has happened in the US as well, is the fact that because we're talking about public health and public issues and things that affect all of us, that I think eternal discussion between or mainly myth many times of refugees and migrants coming to our countries and fighting for our resources has become one of the key speeches around the pandemic, because we're giving help to migrants that might not have been born in our home countries, but because we have a public health issue, that's the way countries are going. But that has been one of the main conversations also around the pandemic surrounding migration.
Super interesting.
Did you want me to weigh on that too, Maria?
If you'd like, yes.
Just to say that I agree. I love the work that Maldita does, that Clara does, and yeah, we're whether it's here in Germany, whether or other parts of Europe, whether it's the US or Australia, New Zealand, where we have partners as well. It's the pandemic creates a lot of new challenges, and yeah, with borders opening up somewhat, but then these different variations, and we don't know the different variants of the virus. It creates this sense of insecurity that can be leveraged by those who are trying to create damaging narratives, unhelpful narratives around immigrants and refugees in these times. So yeah,
that's super interesting, David.
But I should also point out that there's challenges, but there's also opportunities right now. With the Afghan crisis, for example, it's organizing and mobilizing those who are trying to send negative messages, and we're seeing this a lot in the U.S. right now. But at the same time, there's more people than ever that are supporting Afghan refugees around the world, and certainly in the United States right now. And so the trick is how do you try to leverage and support that wave of support and welcoming that's coming around the world during this migrant crisis. Also during prior migrant crisis, we had these same sort of situations, similar situations. How do you leverage the positive things about it towards welcoming, but also, you know, try to mitigate some of the organizing and ways that the other side or those who are looking to, you know, have a much more restrictionist focus are using the time as well, using the messages as well.
That's a very interesting. Go ahead, Clara.
Sorry, no, that one of the things that, and I'm sure that it's exactly the same that has happened with other refugee crises in Europe in 2016 or so, that we get to this point in which there's a part of the population that is willing to help and to welcome, and there's a part of the population that has doubts, and it's been politically used to be withdrawn to the sides of the conversation, both of them. And the hardest part is how to get to talk to the people that are actually in the middle, that are not convinced that welcoming right away is the best part, are not convinced that there should be no migration entering our countries, but they need data, they need context, and they need many more explanations that are probably not being given by national governments, for example.
That's super interesting, and brings us to a point I was also interested in touching, because I know we all agree here on the importance of stories to talk to these middle people who are not fully convinced or are open to changing their minds also, which is something wonderful we need people to engage more in doing in the future. And in that sense, maybe David, you could touch into this. What have you seen that particularly works in the field of building these positive stories and truthful narratives that help us get these people through the message to their whole, and maybe choose an attitude that is positive and is creating positive change around?
Sure, and I agree with Clara. We've always seen this dynamic where, and polling tends to bear this out, that there's maybe 10% that are very welcoming, 10% that are very unwelcoming, and then what do you do with that 10 to 20% on either side, and that you know, movable middle? We tend to call the middle the people who are sort of unsure, not sure about which way to go, the unsure, and the untapped are those who would be welcoming and would join the movement if they knew how to, or they knew that it existed. So those are our two main audiences, the untapped and then the unsure. But on communications, it's the unsure that is the main audience. And for the unsure or the movable middle or what have you, certain things that tend to work in our experience. One is not focusing so much on facts, and certainly not national. Anything national or international, it doesn't tend to resonate. Like, for example, whether it's the message itself or the messenger. In the United States, for example, we work with government officials around with other messengers. And on the national level, government is trusted by about 20% in the United States, for example, of the population, whereas local government and local mayors are trusted, according to polling, by about 70% of the population. So people trust local messengers and local messages. If you are going to use facts, make them localized. And if you're going to use messengers, when you can, try to use local messengers. But besides that, there's also just, instead of facts focusing on values, people feel like people who are unsure might be afraid that their values aren't going to be replaced by the values of people coming in. So to show how local people, local immigrants and refugees share the values that are important specifically to this community, because different communities value different things. So those types of values messages that are resonant and local and match the local values. For example, in Nashville, in Tennessee, one of the values is welcoming the stranger, which is kind of a religious message, and that was a message that resonated with people in the buckle of the Bible Belt of the United States, for example. But also, if you're going to use economic messages, which can be not productive always, you can do that if you're showing how local immigrant entrepreneurs are creating jobs. But again, local. If you want to use economics, local also, and focusing on economic contributions of real people in your community. tends to work better than basic, general economic facts that are vague and easily dismissed.
That's super. So going local and focusing on values.
Yeah.
Would work. Clara, how about your learnings in this field? You're more focused on facts and giving true information, right?
But this is very good. I have similar conversations with other fellows dedicated to migration here in Spain, like Por Causa, and we always have this kind of conversation. They tend to tell me we need to focus on values and tell stories, and we have a different approach. And I think it's because we're approaching different publics, and I don't think they're antagonistic in any way. The thing is that when we build Maldita.es, which is our project focused on debunking myths and misinformation around migration population, we decided that we needed to address the people that were almost convinced by the polarized zone that is telling that they shouldn't come in. So we realized that for that, we needed to focus on the kind of data that they were using and trying to debunk it. And there we go many times to economic data, to data related to jobs, to data related to public aid taken by migration population, to data related to the different parts of the world people are coming from, and this typical discourse of the implantation of a different culture. Because we wanted to convince that side, we needed to use those kinds of arguments and bring them back. And the other thing we did, and I think that has worked very well for us, is that we've been extremely criticized for it. Just take that the name of the project is Damn Migration. So you can imagine how criticized we've been. But we do it because we believe that when one of the places where people are finding most of the misinformation around migration that are getting more polarized to that side is within the internet. So we needed to place in Google search terms that were negative for migration population, but that were the terms that people that was almost convinced were looking for, so that we could debunk it in a more effective way. And I know it's controversial, but trust me, it has worked. We're the main results for the kind of terms that are usually used against migration population, because we're the first search term, we're able to debunk it more easily and to reach a bigger part of the population.
And Maria, if I could just add, I agree with Maldita's approach. Actually, it's part of recognizing, and this is something that social movements don't always do. It's recognizing that we're all part of the same movement and we're using different approaches to get to the same place, and the approaches are completely complementary. So in the kind of welcoming space, when you're trying to reach both the untapped, which are people who are going to really respond to values, and and maybe the unsure, but not the same part of the unsure as what Maldita is approaching, you need to have both. You need and this is an important part of movements, is not criticizing people are doing it differently, but actually recognizing, oh, this is actually exactly what we need. Together, we're going to create the whole. So I completely agree with Maldita's approach.
Of course,
and appreciate it.
I think that's the good part of having different organizations, and actually of you or me being here, is because we reach different parts of the same target that we're trying to fill.
Yeah, exactly.
That's amazing, and I absolutely see, and part of our work of Ashoka is learning from those who take different approach and learning how to work together. So I thank you, David, for making that point. And Clara, also something also interests me a lot of your work is how you point on education being the only vaccine against misinformation. And how do you see the field of educating people, and who are you targeting when you're targeting education about misinformation in the immigration field?
So I think we're doing two basic things right now. That is also because it's the things that we think are the most important, but also the ones that we can reach. One is we're working a lot on hate speech among the youngest population, because we believe that there's there has been a movement within the Spanish young population to more racist speeches than some time before. And there has been a rise in crimes against migrants here in Spain in the past few years, which we think it's very preoccupating in the end. So we've launched with FAD, which is like a very big organization that works with youngsters here in Spain, an app that teaches them how to recognize hate speech and how to fight it, both on social media, so how to denounce that there has been a hate speech around migration and other types of hate speech, and also in their schools, in their jobs, in their daily life. That's on one side. The other thing that we're doing right now, it's starting to work with migrant population here in Spain so that they're able to recognize when they're being targeted by hate speech and when they can actually have tools and data to debunk misinformation that is creating hate speech against them. So we're trying to give them tools to fact check, but also resources in which to check data that can help them debunk misinformation around their population.
That's super interesting. And I see the team has put the links to the app in the chat so everyone can research to that and get a closer look at what Clara is telling us. I have a question from the audience, unless you, David, want to complement anything we're talking about, or if not,
let's hear from the audience.
Questions. Yeah. So the question is your work and message, I think it's for both, so feel free to take the mic, whoever has a first answer. So is your work and message changing, and are ideas of migrants changing as climate-related displacements increase? Fires in many parts of Europe and US, floods elsewhere, earthquakes, etc. So is our work and message changing as climate-related displacements increase in the world? How does climate jump into this already complicated conversation?
So I can start on this if that's okay. It's a great question. We have to be able to respond to external situations. So when I say we have partners, communities all over the U.S., but also Australia, New Zealand, Germany. Work in Tenerife with partners in Tenerife, in Spain, United Kingdom, Canada, Mexico. So all these places are experiencing already climate change in different ways. But climate migration, although it's already happening, it's going to become more recognized as the cause of migration soon, but not quite yet. And so on that field, when it comes to mass refugee crises, that climate change is affecting that, and that can be said for Afghanistan and the other crises that have happened, or situations that have happened. And so yeah, we're focused on dealing with refugee crises. We're focused on dealing with the challenges that are out there. But COVID, of course, is a big focus, but we're also sort of building the groundwork to be prepared for the climate migration story and the climate migration reality, because people are already on the move in the world more than ever before, and climate change is going to hugely accelerate that. And so to not the infrastructure that I talked about before, having that narrative infrastructure, having the institutional infrastructure in communities, and building that up to the nation internationally. If you don't have that, and then this huge situation starts to really unfold, it's going to create all sorts of unrest and challenges. And so putting in this infrastructure now, getting ready for the great increases later is essential, and that's what we're focused on as far as climate change. But that is honestly, unfortunately, the future of this work, in my opinion. It's going to be where migration is most driven by in the future, I think.
I'm gonna take it from a different angle, because I totally agree with David that whatever we're doing now, it's gonna serve that situation that is already taking place, even though we might not call it like that. But when we have half Africa flooding to the north of the continent in order to access Europe, that's a climate change migration movement. It doesn't have a different name. It has to do with poverty. It has to do with a lot of things, but it's been influenced by climate for over 50 years now. The approach we're getting there from Maldita and from a fact-checking perspective is that I think we've been talking about fact-checking climate change for a long time, because there is a lot of denial discourse out there, and there's probably a lot of discourse that is not hold on data, but on predictions that might not be so easy to prove right now. So we, within the fact-checking community, we're having a huge debate on how do we fact-check this, and how can we fact-check the future. And it's not so easy, it's very challenging. We're trying to learn from one another around the world, seeing which kind of methodology we can applicate that it's as rigorous as the one we do for regular political fact-checking on a daily basis, and that we can stand by even if then the prediction it's not fulfilled, but we can say that the data did hold those kinds of views.
Super interesting.
One other thing on this point is along with creating the infrastructure and addressing the denialism, there's also just international policies and norms also that have to change, and national policies. Right now, climate refugees are not recognized as refugees primarily in the world. And so people are forced to move, but they can't get the status that they need to live in other places when it's caused by climate. And that's going to need to change. Otherwise, yeah, it's going to be even more of a mess. But creating that positive climate so that people see the benefits that refugees bring and understand that this is not this is a positive for communities is key to getting those policy changes to happen.
And that ties perfectly to a second question we have from our audience that says, which countries do you see are doing better than others in terms of setting this climate in a cooperative way a little bit better? Do you have any examples of countries which are doing a good job?
Yeah, fortunately we do. I mentioned some of the places where we have partners and where we work. New Zealand is often a shining beacon, not always, but often. And in our case, it is the government of New Zealand. We have different partners in different countries, but in New Zealand, the government is actually the lead partner and member of the Welcoming International Initiative in New Zealand. And so they've invested $7 billion in building these welcoming communities and scaling what they piloted 8 or 9 communities. And now they're trying to scale it to half the cities and towns in New Zealand in the next couple of years. They've created a welcoming standard. They certify cities as welcoming. So New Zealand is towards the front of the pack as far as where you actually have alignment between the local and the national. That's starting to happen more in the United States with the new administration. That certainly didn't happen in the last administration. So the United States has the potential, but there's a lot of challenges. Canada is also a shining light so far on this. We'll see what happens in the next elections there. But the Canadian government is hugely invested in welcoming, supporting welcoming communities. They're part of our network. And then, as far as the work happening, well, I should say also Germany, the government is also, the national government is supporting this local bottom-up work as well with funding and support along with, the Bertelsmann Foundation, who's the national partner. I would say New Zealand, Canada, and to some extent Germany are towards the front. We'll see what happens. Germany's kind of wavering right now with the Afghan situation, but we'll see. I would say those are towards the top of the list so far. As far as the places where we work, there's plenty of places where we don't work where there's also been a good response. And
Clara, do you see some countries cooperating well with the fact-checking community in this sense, or other, maybe not governments, but companies or private sector or population? Are there any examples of some places where this is working well?
I don't think there's any, or not that I know of, at least any policy of institutions or platforms or private companies that are cooperating to fight misinformation around migration. Certainly not governments in general, because fact checkers tend to fact check migration issues, but also politicians. So that doesn't get so easy. And I wouldn't say the private sector nor the platforms are there yet. There is some collaboration with platforms such as Facebook. There is no collaborations with other misinformation distributors like YouTube, but there's a long way to go yet, and I think we're building the bridges to do that. I think there's a lot of collaboration in some specific countries, like here in Spain, in some South American countries, with specific associations that are dedicated to migration and aid, but not so much with public or private institutions, more with collective civic institutions.
Thank you very much. That's a light of hope, and that ties to the last question. I'd love to learn from you. What energizes you most thinking about the next 3 to 5 years? What's coming up? What brings you energy to do the amazing work you're doing today?
I can go ahead, David. I think we have a lot of challenging years coming. I think that the 2016 crisis, at least for Europe, made us realize that migration was going to be one of the big issues within the political scene in the European Union. And I think that has translated worldwide. If we're seeing Venezuela and Colombia, if we're seeing immigration entering the US from South America. But I do believe that this has come also a more social topic that wasn't so much talked about as a political stand before. I think immigration used to be, didn't make a difference in the position that you had on political issues, and now it does. It does for politicians that need to address it one way or the other, and that's generating a lot of polarization, but it's also important for citizens when they go to vote. And I think that can be a tipping point in the way we treat migration in the future, which I think we all foresee that it's not going to be an easy situation.
Thank you, Clara. David?
So I agree with Clara that it's not going to be a walk in the park over the next 5 years. But what energizes me most is, first of all, to see these the welcoming movements in these different countries around the world continue to scale upward. These bottom-up movements that eventually, go in the United States, it was from 1 community to 200 cities. In Australia, it was from 1. If Welcoming Australia had 1 city, and now they're 3 years later at 65 cities. They're the fastest growing welcoming movement in the world. So to see these movements continue to spread upwards, and right now they're sort of hidden, and people think everything is negative, but they don't know that there's this upswell of support and infrastructure that's gaining and growing, and that in the next 5 years those will become more public and more known, and will give people more optimism and help new people sort of get involved that didn't feel like there was anything that they could do but wanted to. So that gives me energy. As far as in regions, Latin America is really exciting to me. I think that we started doing work in Mexico, which is very exciting for me. Personally, I've worked a lot with the U.S.-Mexico interchange between activists and organizers in the 2 places, and governments, et cetera. But I think there's a huge amount of energy to try to create an infrastructure for all the refugees and immigrants that are moving right now in Latin America. And so to be able to support that in some way, to see that infrastructure and that the ecosystem grow, I think that there's a lot of potential there. And I'm excited to see in the United States particularly how this surge of welcome for Afghan refugees hopefully is fully turns into an upswell that starts to shift people's perceptions, so more people really understand the value that immigrants and refugees bring in the US, and that narrative can spread to other places. Those are things that give me hope and energy, but doesn't mean it'll be easy, but it's still worthwhile.
No one said it's going to be easy. I think that was super clear from this wonderful conversation. But what we know is that we need more change makers around this topic. We are seeing more change makers coming up. And I wanted to thank you both for the amazing work you're doing in not only inspiring many change makers to really get their hands on the trouble and get involved, but also telling their stories and making people and this unsure middle we talked about before, aware of what's also happening, and not only about the bad news and the skepticism we of course see around the issue of human mobility and how we're treating each other. So thank you both very much for joining us today. I know there are many links in the chat, so people hopefully can continue the conversation with both of you and with your teams online, and engage in many opportunities we have created. And so thank you both very much. I hope to see you soon again and continue this conversation forward. And for those who were joining, thank you so much for staying up a little bit more than we had predicted. Look out for a follow-up email with the link to today's conversation and highlights to browse and share with whoever couldn't be here today. And we also hope you will join us next time. Welcome Change is a weekly series about the future we want to live in and the role we can all play. So you can sign up at the link in the chat and make sure you join us every week, starting this week again, for amazing conversations like the one we had today. So have good days, everyone. Thank you again so much, Clara and David, and hope to see you all soon.
Thanks so much, Maria.
Thanks for everything, Maria.